The air in the Kang Syndicate's boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cedarwood and the cold, metallic tang of absolute power. To the 20 men seated around the table, Amara Nwasu was merely an efficient shadow, a silent, beautiful black woman who moved with the grace of someone who didn't want to be noticed. But beneath her crisp white silk blouse, Amara was a map of secret agony. Every breath felt like shards of glass pressing into her ribs. The bruises on her forearms, hidden beneath long sleeves, throbbed in time with the erratic hammering of her heart. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her dark knuckles turning a ghostly gray as the room began to tilt. "Don't fall," she pleaded with herself. "Don't let the dragon see you bleed." At the head of the table, Kang Junhyuk sat with the lethal stillness of a loaded weapon. His intense, unreadable gaze was fixed on the city's skyline, but he didn't need to look at Amara to feel her presence. To the world, he was a monster. To Amara, he was the man she had spent months serving in silence, secretly memorizing the sharp line of his jaw and the way the intricate Mafia tattoo climbed up his neck like a warning. Suddenly, the golden sunset streaming through the windows turned into a blinding white static. Amara's knees gave way. The files scattered like wounded birds, and as the floor rushed up to meet her, the dragon moved. Before she could hit the marble, massive, warm hands caught her. Junhyuk didn't just catch his secretary, he claimed her. In one fluid, violent motion, he pulled her into the solid stone of his chest. "Amara," his voice, usually a cold blade of authority, cracked with a raw, desperate edge. As he reached to check her pulse, his thumb caught the fabric of her sleeve, pulling it back. The golden light hit the deep, dark bruises marring her mahogany skin. The room went deathly silent. The syndicate lieutenants watched in shock as the man who never showed emotion let out a low, guttural growl that sounded less like a man and more like a predator finding its mate wounded. Kang Junhyuk didn't just lose his temper, he lost his soul, and in that moment, the invisible secretary's fate was changed forever. "Hello, family. Before we proceed, I would love to ask us a question. When a man who never shows emotion finally loses control for a woman he's supposed to ignore, is it love or is it obsession? What do you think Junhyuk's next move will be?" Comment where you are watching from in the comments section, and subscribe to this channel if you are new here. Now let's dive into the story. Kang Junhyuk did not wait for the body to strike the floor. The sound of the files scattering, a dry, rhythmic fluttering of paper against mahogany, was the only warning the room received before the air seemed to shatter. He moved with a predatory grace that defied his heavy, tailored frame, his chair skidding back with a harsh screech against the marble. Before Amara could succumb to the gravity that had been pulling at her soul all morning, she was anchored. Junhyuk's hands, massive and radiating a terrifying heat, clamped around her waist and shoulders. He didn't just catch her, he hauled her against him, her head falling into the hollow of his neck, her dark curls tangling in the sharp lapels of his charcoal suit. For a heartbeat, the boardroom was a tomb. The high-ranking lieutenants of the Kang Syndicate sat frozen, their breaths held. They had seen Junhyuk order executions with a flick of his wrist. They had seen him walk through blood without blinking. But they had never seen him touch anyone with this kind of desperate, jagged urgency. "Amara." Junhyuk's voice was a low vibration against her temple, a sound of raw, unpolished fear that none of his men recognized. His thumb, calloused and steady, hooked beneath the silk of her white sleeve. He didn't ask for permission. He pulled the fabric back, exposing the deep mahogany skin of her forearm. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the truth was undeniable. The skin was a chaotic map of purple and yellowish green, the unmistakable, finger-shaped imprints of a man's violence. A low, guttural sound tore from Junhyuk's throat, a growl that wasn't human. It was the sound of a dragon realizing its treasure had been tampered with. His jaw tightened until the muscles corded like iron, and the intricate tattoo on his neck seemed to darken, pulsing with a sudden, violent spike in his blood pressure. His eyes, usually cold and assessing, turned into pits of lethal, focused obsidian. "Sir, the North District merger," one lieutenant started, his voice trembling as he tried to bridge the sudden, terrifying gap in the meeting's professionalism. Junhyuk didn't even look at him. He didn't look at any of them. He swept his arm beneath Amara's knees, lifting her into a bridal carry that looked as effortless as it was possessive. He held her high against his chest, shielding her face from the prying eyes of the room. "The meeting is over," Jun Hyuk said. His voice was no longer a cold blade, it was a death sentence. "If anyone leaves this room before I return, they leave without their head." He turned and strode toward the double oak doors. He didn't wait for his security detail to open them. He kicked them wide, the heavy wood thudding against the walls like a thunderclap. Every step he took through the office was a declaration of war. The glass and steel hallways of the Kang Syndicate, usually buzzing with the quiet efficiency of a multi-billion-dollar empire, fell into a paralyzed silence as the dragon passed. Staff members pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes wide as they watched their boss, the man who viewed the world as a game of chess, carrying his secretary as if she were the only living thing that mattered. Amara groaned softly in her semi-consciousness, her hand instinctively clutching the front of his white dress shirt. Her knuckles were dark against the fabric, her small, trembling frame dwarfed by his massive shoulders. Jun Hyuk's grip tightened, his fingers digging slightly into the fabric of her skirt, his pace never faltering. He bypassed the main elevators where the common staff waited. He headed straight for his private lift, the one that required a biometric scan and led only to the basement garage and his penthouse. As the lift doors hissed shut, cutting them off from the world, the silence inside the small gold-leafed box was deafening. Jun Hyuk didn't set her down. He leaned his back against the mirrored wall, breathing heavily, his chest heaving against hers. He looked down at her face, the soft oval of her cheeks, the long sweep of her lashes, and the sheer exhaustion written in the lines of her mouth. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling as he brushed a stray curl away from her forehead. He had spent months watching her from across the boardroom, admiring the way she navigated his dangerous world with a quiet, brilliant dignity. He had told himself he was keeping her at a distance for her own safety, that the dragon shouldn't have a weakness. He had been wrong. By keeping her at a distance, he had left her unprotected. The lift chimed as it hit the garage level. His black armored sedan was already idling, the exhaust a low, menacing hum in the shadows. His lead driver, a man who had served Jun Hyuk for a decade, stepped out to open the door but stopped dead when he saw the look on his employer's face. It wasn't the look of a businessman. It was the look of a man who was ready to watch the city burn. Jun Hyuk climbed into the back, still refusing to let Amara go. He sat in the middle of the leather bench, pulling her onto his lap and tucking her head under his chin. He wrapped his suit jacket around her, covering the white blouse and the ruined sleeves, hiding her shame within his own shadow. "Drive," he barked, his voice echoing in the enclosed space of the car. "To the penthouse, and call Dr. Han. Tell him if he isn't waiting at the private entrance when we arrive, he will never practice medicine again." As the car tore out of the garage and into the neon-soaked streets of Seoul, Jun Hyuk stared out the window. The city lights blurred into long, vengeful streaks of red and gold. He didn't know who had done this yet. He didn't know the name of the man who had dared to put his hands on Amara and Wasu. But as he felt her shallow, pained breath against his neck, a cold, absolute certainty settled in his bones. Whoever it was, they were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The dragon wasn't just losing control. He was reclaiming what was his, and he would tear the world apart to ensure she never had to hide a bruise again. The silence of the private medical suite was a sharp, clinical contrast to the chaotic roar of the city outside. Nestled in the highest reaches of the Kang Syndicate's headquarters, the room smelled of ozone, sterile linen, and the underlying scent of Jun Hyuk's cedarwood cologne. He did not call for a nurse. He did not wait for his head physician to arrive. Instead, Jun Hyuk placed Amara on the edge of a pristine white examination table with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. Amara's consciousness flickered back to the surface, her eyelids fluttering against the harsh overhead lights. The first thing she felt was the heat, radiating from the man standing between her knees. Jun Hyuk had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar and sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with tension. "Stay still," he murmured. The cold, razor-edged CEO was gone, replaced by a man whose voice was a low, desperate rasp. He reached for a tray of antiseptic and soft gauze, his movements methodical yet trembling. When he reached for the hem of her sleeve, Amara instinctively flinched, a small, pained whimper escaping her parched throat. Jun Hyuk froze. His eyes met hers, obsidian pits of focused intensity, and for a moment the air in the room seemed to vanish. "I will not hurt you, Amara," he whispered, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her neck. "Never you." With a precision that spoke of a man used to handling both delicate glass and deadly weapons, he began to peel back the fabric of her blouse. As the deep brown of her skin was fully revealed, so too was the extent of the horror. The bruises were fresh, a sickening symphony of violet, blue, and mottled yellow that wrapped around her ribs and arms like a cage. Jun Hyuk's breath hitched. A dark, visceral sound started deep in his chest, a growl of pure, unadulterated fury. As his anger spiked, the intricate dragon tattoo that wound up his neck and disappeared into his hairline seemed to come alive. The ink appeared to pulse against his light ivory skin, the dragon's tail twitching as the veins in his neck stood out, thick and strained. He was a monster trying to remember how to be a man, his internal battle written in the jagged lines of his ink. He dipped a cloth into warm water and began to dab at a particularly dark mark on her shoulder. The touch was feather-light, almost a caress. Amara watched him through a haze of exhaustion and confusion. She had spent months thinking this man was a glacier, a figure of stone and steel who barely saw her as more than a machine that processed his files. But as he worked, she saw the way his jaw worked, the way his eyes tracked every wince she made as if the pain were his own. "Why?" she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. Jun Hyuk stopped his work, his hand hovering just inches from her skin. He didn't look up. "Because you have been hiding in the shadows of my world for 6 months, Amara, and I was too blinded by my own rules to see that you were breaking." He finally raised his gaze, and the raw obsession she saw there made her heart hammer against her bruised ribs. "I hired you because you were the best. I kept you because I couldn't imagine a morning where you weren't the first thing I saw. And I am going to tear the world apart because someone thought they could touch what is mine." The word mine hung in the sterile air, heavy and absolute. It wasn't the claim of a boss over an employee, it was the claim of a predator over its mate. He returned to his task, cleaning the grazes on her elbows with a focus that was terrifyingly intimate. Every time his skin brushed hers, a jolt of electricity surged through Amara, a dangerous warmth that began to drown out the dull throb of her injuries. She looked at the dragon tattoo on his neck again, watching it rise and fall with his ragged breathing. It was a marker of his life in the underworld, a sign of the blood he had shed and the power he held. And yet, here he was, using those same lethal hands to tend to her with the tenderness of a devotee at an altar. "I tried to handle it," Amara said, her eyes welling with tears she had been holding back for weeks. "I thought if I was just professional enough, if I stayed invisible enough." "You were never invisible to me," Jun Hyuk interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, velvety depth. He set the cloth aside and took both of her hands in his thumbs tracing the line of her knuckles. "I saw every late night you worked. I saw every time you bit your lip to keep from complaining. I saw it all, and I let myself believe you were just as untouchable as I was." He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against hers. The scent of him, woodsy, masculine, and intoxicating, enveloped her. In the silence of the medical suite, the power dynamic that had defined their lives for half a year dissolved. She wasn't the secretary, and he wasn't the boss. They were two broken pieces of a dangerous puzzle, finally clicking into place. "Sleep now," he commanded softly, though it was a plea. He lifted her easily, moving her to the recovery bed and pulling a weighted silk blanket over her. "My doctors will be here in minutes. My guards are at the door, and I will be just outside." As Amara's eyes drifted shut, the last thing she saw was the back of Jun Hyuk as he turned toward the door. The dragon on his neck seemed to flare one last time in the dimming light, a silent promise of the violence he was about to unleash on her behalf. She was falling into a sleep she knew would be safe, protected by a monster who had finally found the one thing he was unwilling to lose. The low, rhythmic hum of the medical equipment was the only sound in the suite, a stark contrast to the storm raging within Kang Jun Hyuk. He stood by the window, the neon lights of Seoul bleeding across his face, but his eyes remained fixed on the reflection in the glass, Amara, pale and motionless beneath the weighted silk blankets. He had watched her for 6 months, admiring the sharp intellect and the quiet grace that made her the most efficient asset in the Kang syndicate. He had thought he knew her. But as he stood there, The image of those finger-shaped bruises burned into his retinas, a map of a nightmare he had failed to prevent. A soft chime signaled the arrival of his head of security. Jun Hyuk didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the kind of tension that usually preceded an execution. "The name," Jun Hyuk demanded. His voice was a thin, lethal wire. "Marcus Thorne," the guard whispered, his head bowed. "Her ex-partner. He's been stalking her for weeks, sir. He cornered her at her apartment 3 nights ago. That's when the primary injuries occurred. He's been calling her, threatening to show up here at the office if she didn't return to him." Jun Hyuk's hand tightened around the glass of water he was holding until the crystal groaned, threatening to shatter. Marcus Thorne. A man who thought he could claim what belonged to the dragon. A man who thought the most precious thing in Jun Hyuk's world was a toy to be broken. The dragon tattoo on Jun Hyuk's neck seemed to flare a violent, dark purple under the clinical lights, his pulse thrumming against the ink with a terrifying regularity. "Find him," Jun Hyuk commanded. It wasn't an order, it was a decree. "I don't want him touched, not yet. I want him brought to the warehouse by the docks. I want him to wait in the dark. I want him to feel the exact moment the world stops being kind to him." The guard vanished as silently as he had appeared, leaving Jun Hyuk alone with the woman who had shattered his icy composure. He walked back to the bedside, his footsteps making no sound on the polished floor. He sat in the chair beside her, leaning forward until his shadow draped over her like a protective shroud. Amara shifted in her sleep, a soft, pained whimper escaping her lips. Her hand, dark and delicate, twitched against the white linen. Jun Hyuk reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering over hers for a long moment before he finally allowed himself to touch her. He didn't just hold her hand, he enveloped it, his thumb tracing the blue veins in her wrist with a tenderness that felt like a sin. "You spent so long trying to be invisible, Amara," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly confession in the dark. "You tried to take up so little space so he wouldn't find you. You thought if you carried the pain in silence, it would eventually go away." He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers, the scent of her natural hair products mixing with the sterile air of the room. The lethal predator who had spent his life building an empire of blood and shadow was gone, replaced by a man making a silent, sacred covenant. "He will never look at you again," Jun Hyuk promised, the words vibrating with a dark, absolute certainty. "He will never speak your name. He will never even occupy the same air you breathe. I am going to erase the memory of his hands from your skin. I am going to burn the world he built for you, and from the ashes. I will give you a kingdom where you never have to hide a bruise again." He watched the rise and fall of her chest, her breathing finally evening out as the sedatives took hold. The rage in his gut didn't subside, it simply crystallized, turning into a cold, hard diamond of intent. He had lived his life by a code of calculated violence, but this was different. This wasn't business. This wasn't territory. This was the dragon reclaiming its heart. He stood up, his tall frame blocking out the moonlight. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had killed, the hands that had built, and the hands that had just spent an hour cleaning the wounds of a woman he had claimed as his own. He realized then that he had been waiting for this moment since the day she first walked into his office with those focused eyes and that quiet dignity. He had just been too afraid of his own weakness to admit it. "Sleep, my Amara," he murmured, his voice dropping to a velvety Korean lilt. "When you wake, the ghost will be gone, the nightmare will be over, and the man who did this will realize that the only thing more dangerous than the dragon is the man who loves the woman the dragon is protecting." He turned toward the door, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. As he stepped out into the hallway, his security detail snapped to attention, sensing the change in him. The corporate mask was gone. The glacier had melted into a river of fire. He walked toward the private lift, his mind already miles away, at a dark warehouse by the docks where a man named Marcus Thorne was about to learn the true cost of touching a king's treasure. The unspoken vow was sealed. The hunt had begun. And as the lift doors closed, Jun Hyuk's eyes burned with a light that suggested he wouldn't stop until the very memory of Amara's fear was incinerated in the flames of his vengeance. The transition from the heavy, drug-induced sleep to consciousness was like rising through deep, dark water. Amara's senses returned in fragments. The scent of expensive sandalwood, the hum of a high-tech climate control system, and the absolute velvet silence that only exists in the penthouses of the ultra-powerful. When she finally forced her eyelids open, she didn't see the sterile white of the medical suite. Instead, she was staring at a ceiling of smoked glass that reflected the shimmering, distant lights of the Seoul skyline. She was in the clouds. Amara tried to shift, but her body felt heavy, pinned by a strange sense of security she hadn't known in years. As she moved, the dull throb in her ribs reminded her of why she was here, but the sharp, biting agony had been numbed. She realized then that she was lying in a bed larger than her entire studio apartment, wrapped in silk sheets that felt like cool water against her skin. Then she felt it, a presence. She turned her head slowly, the movement cautious. In the corner of the vast, dimly lit master suite, a single designer lamp cast a warm, amber glow over a leather armchair. There, still dressed in the white shirt from the boardroom, now wrinkled and unbuttoned halfway down his chest, sat Kang Junhyuk. He wasn't sleeping. His long legs were crossed at the ankles, and a crystal glass of amber liquid sat untouched on the side table. He was leaning back, his head resting against the leather, his intense gaze fixed directly on her. The shadows played across the sharp, angular lines of his face, making the dragon tattoo on his neck look like a living thing curled against his throat. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated through the quiet room, sounding as though he hadn't spoken in hours. "How long?" Amara whispered, her own voice sounding small and fragile in the cavernous space. "It's 2:14 a.m., he replied, checking the heavy gold watch on his wrist without looking away from her. "You've been under for 10 hours. The doctor said the exhaustion was as dangerous as the trauma. Your body simply gave up." Amara pushed herself up into a sitting position, clutching the silk duvet to her chest. The movement caused her sleeve to slip, revealing the neat bandages Junhyuk had applied himself. Seeing him there, in the dead of night, watching her sleep with the focus of a sentry, made her heart skip a beat, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, overwhelming intimacy. "You stayed," she noted, the realization hitting her with the weight of a physical blow. "You've been sitting there all night." Junhyuk stood up, his massive frame unfolding with a predatory grace. He walked toward the bed, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. He stopped just inches from the edge of the mattress, the heat radiating from him cutting through the cool air of the penthouse. "I find I have little taste for sleep when my house is in disorder," he said, though the look in his eyes told a different story. It wasn't about the house. It was about her. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he tucked a stray curl behind her ear. His touch was electric, his thumb lingering for a second too long against her jawline. "I told you, Amara, you are no longer invisible. That means I don't look away anymore." Amara looked up at him, seeing the dark circles under his eyes and the raw, protective fury that he was trying so hard to suppress for her sake. For 6 months, she had seen him as a glacier, cold, distant, and immovable. But here, in the middle of the night, she saw the fire beneath the ice. "Mr. Kang." "Junhyuk," he corrected softly, his voice dropping to that dangerous, velvety lilt that made her toes curl. "In this room, there is no chairman. There is no secretary. There is only a man who failed to see his greatest treasure was being tarnished, and the woman who is going to let him make it right." He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sinking under his weight. He didn't move to touch her again, but the proximity was enough to make her breath hitch. He looked out at the city lights, his jaw tightening. "This place is a fortress," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "No one enters without my thumbprint. No one leaves without my word. You will stay here until the marks on your skin are gone and the fear in your eyes is replaced by something else." "And what would that be?" Amara asked, her voice gaining a sliver of its usual strength. Junhyuk turned back to her, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that felt like a brand. "Power," he said simply. "The kind of power that comes from knowing that the most dangerous man in the city would burn it to the ground just to keep you smiling. You've spent too long being afraid of a small man, Amara. It's time you learned what it feels like to be loved by a monster." Amara felt a tear escape and track down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. For the first time in 3 weeks, the martyr complex she had carried like a shield began to crumble. She looked at the man who had caught her before she hit the floor, and for the first time she didn't see a boss or a mobster. She saw a sanctuary. "Thank you, Junhyuk," she whispered. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he took her hand, his massive palm engulfing hers, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. It was a silent, dark promise kept in the clouds of Seoul, a vow that the nightmare was over and a new, more dangerous dream was just beginning. The golden glow of the city continued to wash over the room, casting Junhyuk's silhouette in sharp relief against the floor-to-ceiling glass. He remained seated on the edge of the bed, his presence a heavy, grounding weight that seemed to push back the shadows of Amara's memory. For a long time, the only sound was the faint hum of the city far below and the synchronized rhythm of their breathing. Amara looked down at their joined hands, his pale, scarred skin against her deep mahogany, and felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to know the why behind his sudden transformation. "You've been watching me for months," she said softly, her voice gaining a steady clarity it hadn't possessed since the collapse. "But you never spoke to me, not about anything other than files, meetings, and logistics. You were the glacier everyone said you were. Why go through all this for a secretary you barely acknowledged?" Junhyuk's thumb stilled against her knuckles. He didn't look away from the horizon immediately, but a small, tight muscle jumped in his jaw. "Is that what you thought? That I barely acknowledged you?" He finally turned his head, his dark eyes searching hers with a raw intensity that made her breath catch. "Amara, there hasn't been a single day in the last 6 months that I wasn't acutely aware of exactly where you were in that building." He let out a short, self-deprecating breath and leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting as if he were replaying a film in his mind. "The day you walked into the interview, you didn't look at me with fear like the others. You looked at me with a quiet, brilliant defiance, as if you were measuring me just as much as I was measuring you. You wore a suit that was a shade too large, and you carried a folder that was organized with a precision that bordered on lethal." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I told the board I hired you because your credentials in strategic analysis were flawless. I told myself I hired you because the syndicate needed your mind. But the truth is much more selfish." He leaned closer, the scent of cedarwood and the heat of his skin enveloping her. "I hired you because after you left that room, I couldn't stop thinking about the way your curls framed your face. I couldn't stop thinking about the sound of your voice. I realized within 10 minutes that if I didn't put you in my office, I would spend my entire life wondering where you had gone." Amara felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, her heart hammering a frantic, confused rhythm against her ribs. "But you were so cold," she whispered. "You treated me like a ghost." "I had to," Junhyuk confessed, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous depth. "I am the head of the Kang Syndicate. My world is built on blood, iron, and the absence of weakness. I've spent 20 years ensuring that I have nothing for my enemies to take. But then you started staying late. You started anticipating my needs before I even voiced them. You became the silence I looked forward to at the end of a chaotic day." He reached out, his fingers tracing the delicate line of her jaw with a reverent touch that contradicted his violent reputation. "I watched you from the head of that table, and every time you bit your lip or adjusted your sleeves, I wanted to reach out and pull you into my space. But I knew what I was. I knew that the closer I brought you to the center of my life, the more danger would follow you. I thought if I stayed cold, I could keep you in the light while I stayed in the dark." He looked down at the bandages on her arm, his expression darkening into that familiar, protective fury. "I thought my distance was your shield. I was so busy protecting you from my world that I failed to see the monster lurking in yours. I was arrogant, Amara. I believed that because you were under my roof, you were safe. I didn't realize that by keeping you an invisible secretary, I was leaving you vulnerable to someone who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as you." Amara reached out, her fingers tentatively brushing the dragon tattoo on his neck. It felt warm, the skin beneath it pulsing with a life of its own. "You're not a monster, Junhyuk. A monster wouldn't have spent 10 hours in a chair watching a woman sleep." "Don't romanticize me yet, Amara," he warned, though his hand covered hers, pressing it more firmly against his neck. "The man who cleaned your wounds is not the man who is going to deal with Marcus Thorne, but you need to understand one thing before the sun comes up." He leaned in until their noses touched, his eyes burning with a possessive, soul-deep obsession. "From the moment we met, you weren't just a secretary. You were the only thing in this city that felt real to me. And now that the mask is off, I am never putting it back on. You are mine to protect, mine to cherish, and mine to avenge. The dragon doesn't negotiate with what it loves. Amara didn't pull away. The fear that had defined her existence for the last 3 weeks was being incinerated by the sheer heat of his gaze. She saw the man behind the myth, a man who was lonely, powerful, and utterly devoted to the woman he had caught before she hit the floor. As the first light of dawn began to gray the edges of the room, she realized that she was no longer the girl hiding in the shadows. She was the light at the center of the dragon's world, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly, terrifyingly powerful. While the soft morning light began to spill into the penthouse, illuminating Amara's peaceful, sleeping form, the world outside was descending into a cold, calculated darkness. Kang Junhyuk had stepped out of the bedroom, the shaken man mask dissolving with every step he took away from her door. By the time he reached the private elevator, his face was a portrait of lethal authority, the kind that had made the Kang Syndicate the most feared name in the underworld. He didn't head to the office. He didn't check the morning markets. Instead, he descended into the bowels of the city, to a place where the sunlight never reached. In a secluded warehouse on the edge of the Han River, 4 of the Syndicate's most efficient retrieval specialists stood in the shadows. They were men who had seen every form of human depravity, yet they stood with their backs straight and their eyes forward, sensing the shift in the air before the elevator doors even opened. When Junhyuk stepped out, he wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was stark against the grime of the warehouse, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon tattoos that seemed to writhe in the flickering overhead light. "Status," Junhyuk barked. The word was a gunshot in the cavernous space. "We found him, Chairman," the lead specialist replied, gesturing toward a small, dimly lit room in the center of the warehouse. "Marcus Thorne. He was at a dive bar in the West District, bragging to his friends about putting a bitch in her place. He didn't even see us coming." Junhyuk's jaw tightened, the muscles cording with such force that the dragon on his neck pulsed with a dark, rhythmic fury. He walked toward the room, his heavy boots echoing against the concrete. Through the reinforced glass of the door, he saw him, a man who looked remarkably ordinary. Marcus Thorne was average in height, average in build, the kind of man who would be invisible in a crowd. It was his ordinariness that made his cruelty so much more loathsome to Junhyuk. This was the small man who had thought he could diminish a woman like Amara. Junhyuk entered the room alone. Marcus was zip-tied to a steel chair, a single light bulb swinging above his head. When the abuser looked up, his initial bravado vanished, replaced by the primitive, wide-eyed terror of a rabbit realizing it was in the shadow of a hawk. "Do you know who I am?" Junhyuk asked. His voice was terrifyingly calm, a low, melodic baritone that promised nothing but pain. I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking. "I have rights, you can't just—" Junhyuk didn't let him finish. He moved with a speed that blurred the air, his hand catching Marcus by the throat. He didn't squeeze, not yet, but the sheer weight of his presence forced the man's head back against the steel chair. Junhyuk leaned in until they were inches apart, the scent of expensive cedarwood mixing with Marcus's sweat and fear. "Rights," Junhyuk whispered. "In my world, the only right you have is the right to breathe until I decide otherwise. You touched Amara Nwasu. You thought she was a ghost. You thought she was someone who could be broken because she was quiet." Junhyuk's grip tightened just enough to make Marcus's eyes bulge. The dragon tattoo on Junhyuk's neck was centimeters from the abuser's face, a silent witness to the carnage that was coming. "She is the only light in this city that I care about," Junhyuk continued, his eyes burning with an obsessive, dark fire. "And you treated her like dirt beneath your feet. You didn't just bruise her skin, you tried to steal her dignity. That is a debt that cannot be paid in cash." He let go, stepping back as Marcus gasped for air, sobbing now. Junhyuk looked down at his own hands, the hands that had cleaned Amara's wounds with such tenderness only hours before. Now, those hands were balled into fists of iron. "I'm not going to kill you," Junhyuk said, and for a fleeting second Marcus looked relieved. But then Junhyuk leaned in again, his smile a jagged, terrifying thing. "Death is a mercy, and I am not a merciful man. You are going to spend the rest of your very long life wishing you had never heard her name. My men are going to take everything you own, your job, your home, your reputation. And then they are going to ensure that every time you close your eyes, you see the dragon." Junhyuk turned his back on the sobbing man, signaling to his guards. The lethal authority of the syndicate was now in motion. It wasn't just a physical beating, it was a systematic dismantling of a human being. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Marcus Thorne would be a ghost, a man erased from society by a predator who had found his reason to hunt. As Jun Hyuk walked back to the elevator, the cold rage in his chest began to settle into a hard, protective diamond. He checked his watch. It was nearly time for Amara to wake up. He needed to wash the scent of the warehouse off his skin. He needed to be the cold boss who was slowly becoming her sanctuary. He had unleashed the monster to protect the queen, and as the elevator climbed back toward the clouds, Jun Hyuk knew that the hunt was just the beginning. He wasn't just venging her past, he was clearing the path for their future. The dragon had claimed its heart, and the world was finally learning that some things are too precious to ever be touched. The transition from the velvet luxury of the penthouse to the cold, industrial dampness of the syndicate's secure holding facility was a silent one. Jun Hyuk sat beside Amara in the back of the armored sedan, his hand never leaving hers. He didn't treat her like a porcelain doll to be shielded anymore. He treated her like a sovereign. He had dressed her in one of his own oversized cashmere sweaters and soft leggings, a physical manifestation of his protection, but his gaze remained fixed on her with a new, somber respect. He wasn't just her savior today, he was her enforcer. When the car hissed to a stop inside the underground bunker, the air grew heavy with the scent of wet concrete and old iron. Jun Hyuk stepped out first, extending a hand to help Amara onto the gravel. He leaned in, his voice a low, private vibration against her ear. "You told me once that you wanted to handle your own life," he murmured, his thumb tracing the fatting bruise on her wrist. "In my world, justice isn't a gift given by the state. It is a choice made by those with the courage to claim it. Today, the power is yours. I am merely the weapon you choose to wield or sheath." Amara took a steadying breath, the chill of the bunker settling in her lungs. She followed him through a series of heavy steel doors, the lethal authority of the Kang Syndicate snapping to attention as they passed. Jun Hyuk led her to a small, darkened observation room. Behind a pane of one-way glass, Marcus Thorne sat zip-tied to a chair, looking like a shattered fragment of the man who had terrorized her. He was disheveled, his eyes darting frantically toward the door he couldn't see through. He looked small, pitiful. Jun Hyuk stood behind Amara, his massive frame a shadow that enveloped her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. The dragon tattoo on his neck was a dark, pulsing witness to the moment. "He is stripped of everything," Jun Hyuk stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "His name is erased from the professional world. His debts have been bought by my firms. He has no home to go to, no allies to call. He exists only because I have allowed him to take another breath." He paused, his grip on her shoulders tightening just a fraction, a silent reminder of his devotion. "I can make his disappearance permanent. Or I can let him live in the ruin I have created for him, knowing that if he ever looks in your direction again, the earth will swallow him whole. Speak, Amara. How do you want to close this book?" Amara stared at the man who had made her feel like a ghost in her own skin. For 3 weeks, she had lived in the shadow of Marcus's cruelty, believing she was weak because she was hurt. But as she looked at him now, guarded by a man who ruled an empire, she realized the truth. Marcus hadn't attacked her because she was weak. He had attacked her because he was terrified of her strength. She felt the heat of Jun Hyuk's chest against her back, the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the dragon. He was offering her more than revenge. He was offering her the agency that Marcus had tried to steal. By letting her decide, Jun Hyuk was proving that she wasn't his subordinate or his pet. She was his equal. "He isn't worth the blood on your hands, Jun Hyuk," Amara finally said, her voice echoing with a newfound, crystalline power. Jun Hyuk tilted his head, his eyes never leaving her reflection in the glass. "Explain." "If you kill him, you make him a martyr in his own sick mind. You finish the story he started," she said, turning in his arms to face him. She reached up, her fingers grazing the sharp line of his jaw. "I want him to live. I want him to walk out of here into a world where he is absolutely nothing. I want him to see your face on every billboard and my name on every corporate masthead, and I want him to know that he could never break me. Let him be a ghost. I'm done being one." A slow, predatory smile spread across Jun Hyuk's face, not the smile of a boss, but the smile of a man who had just found a queen worthy of his throne. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, his breath hitching in a way that betrayed his pride. "A ghost," Junhyuk repeated, the words a dark, melodic vow. "Then so it shall be." He signaled to his men without looking away from her. The command was silent, but absolute. Marcus Thorne would be cast out into a life of total insignificance, a shadow haunted by the knowledge of the dragon he had accidentally awakened. As they walked back toward the car, the heavy doors of the bunker clanging shut behind them, Amara felt a weight lift that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The martyr complex was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She looked at Junhyuk, the man whose hands had caught her and whose heart had claimed her. She wasn't just safe, she was transformed. "You gave me a choice," she whispered as they settled back into the leather sanctuary of the sedan. "I gave you what was always yours," Junhyuk replied, pulling her into his lap and tucking her head under his chin. "You were never a secretary to me, Amara. You were a storm I was waiting to be caught in. And now that the sky has cleared, it's time we show this city what happens when a dragon finally finds his equal." As the car accelerated away from the secure location, heading back toward the clouds of Seoul, Amara didn't look back. The past was a ruin, and Marcus was a memory. Ahead of them lay a kingdom of blood and silk, and for the first time, she was ready to rule it. The return to the penthouse felt different this time. The glass and marble fortress no longer seemed like a cold cage of corporate secrets, but a sanctuary hovering above a world that could no longer touch them. As the private elevator chimed softly, opening into the expanse of the living area, the city lights below looked like fallen stars scattered across the dark velvet of Seoul. Junhyuk did not let go of Amara's hand. He led her toward the master's suite, his silence no longer the icy wall of a distant chairman, but the heavy, vibrating quiet of a man who had finally brought his heart home. He stopped at the edge of the balcony doors, the moonlight catching the dark ink of the dragon on his neck. "You haven't looked away from me all night," Amara whispered, her voice a soft thread in the vast room. She turned to face him, the oversized cashmere sweater he had given her slipping slightly off one shoulder, revealing the rich, deep brown of her skin. Junhyuk reached out, his hand trembling with a raw, unpolished honesty that shattered his lethal reputation. He cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her lip. "I spent 6 months looking away because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. I was afraid that if I looked too long, I wouldn't be able to stop until you were exactly where you are now." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his scent, that intoxicating blend of cedarwood and primal heat, enveloping her. "I told myself I was protecting you by being cold. But tonight, watching you stand in that bunker, watching you reclaim your power, I realized I wasn't just obsessed with a secretary. I was in love with a queen." Amara reached up, her fingers tangling in the thick black hair at the nape of his neck. The martyr complex she had carried for years, the need to be small and invisible to survive, dissolved in the heat of his gaze. "Then stop looking, Junhyuk," she breathed, her heart hammering a joyful, frantic rhythm. "Just be here, with me." The kiss was not the tentative gesture of a first-time lover. It was a collision of 6 months of suppressed longing and the violent, protective devotion of a man who had claimed his mate. It was demanding and consuming, a silent conversation where he apologized for every day he had left her in the shadows, and she thanked him for catching her when the world went dark. Junhyuk lifted her easily, his massive frame a solid anchor against her lithe, resilient body. He carried her to the bed, the silk sheets cool against their skin as the night deepened. In the dim light, the marks on her body, the fatting yellows and purples, were no longer symbols of her trauma. They were the map that had led him to her. He touched her with a reverence that was almost painful, his large hands tracing every curve of her mahogany skin as if he were memorizing a sacred text. Every brush of his lips against her shoulder, every whisper of her name in a low, gravelly Korean lilt was a brick being laid in the foundation of their new world. He didn't just claim her body, he claimed her fears, her scars, and her silence, replacing them with a possessive, soul-deep security. As the hours drifted toward dawn, the obsessive boss was gone. In his place was a man who moved with a tender, rhythmic grace, his movements synchronized with her soft, breathless sighs. Amara felt herself opening to him, not out of weakness, but out of a terrifying, beautiful strength. She was no longer the girl hiding bruises. She was the woman who had survived the fire and found a dragon to guard her gates. They lay tangled together in the aftermath, the blue light of the pre-dawn sky beginning to gray the edges of the room. Jun Hyuk held her tightly against his chest, her head tucked beneath his chin, his heartbeat a steady, powerful drum against her ear. "It was written in the stars, wasn't it?" Amara murmured, her fingers tracing the intricate dragon tattoo on his neck. "The moment I walked into that interview, the world was already moving toward this." Jun Hyuk tightened his grip, his lips pressing a firm, lingering kiss to the crown of her head. "The stars didn't have a choice, Amara. Neither did I from the second you looked at me with that brilliant defiance. My fate was no longer my own. It belonged to you." In the quiet of the penthouse, the power dynamic of the Kang Syndicate was fundamentally altered. There was no more chairman, no more secretary. There was only the man who would burn the world for her and the woman who was finally home. As the sun began to rise over Seoul, they didn't look back at the ruins of their old lives. They looked at each other, scarred, whole, and perfectly, dangerously in love. The glass doors of the Kang Syndicate headquarters didn't just open. They seemed to part like a curtain for a long-awaited finale. The lobby, a sprawling expanse of white marble and hushed corporate whispers, fell into a vacuum of silence the moment the black armored sedan pulled up to the curb. Usually, Kang Jun Hyuk entered alone, a solitary, lethal force of nature that sent staff scurrying into the shadows. But today, the dragon was not alone. The heavy car door was opened not by a valet, but by the head of security, who stood at a rigid attention that felt more like a royal salute. Jun Hyuk stepped out, looking every bit the underworld king in a bespoke three-piece suit, but he didn't move toward the entrance. Instead, he turned back and extended his hand, his fingers steady and waiting. Amara took it. She stepped out into the crisp Seoul morning, her curls catching the light like a halo of dark silk. She was no longer wearing the muted, high-collared disguises of a woman in hiding. She wore a tailored suit of deep emerald green that complemented the rich glow of her mahogany skin, her head held high, her eyes clear and unburdened. As she tucked her hand into the crook of Jun Hyuk's arm, the physical connection sent a ripple of shock through the assembled staff. They didn't walk through the side entrance. They didn't take the service elevator. Jun Hyuk led her directly through the main lobby, his pace slow and deliberate, forcing every eye in the building to witness the shift in the universe. He wasn't just walking with his secretary, he was presenting his sovereign. As they reached the bank of elevators, the same lieutenants who had witnessed Amara's collapse weeks ago were standing there, frozen mid-conversation. They looked at her, then at the possessive grip Jun Hyuk maintained on her waist, and finally at the dragon tattoo pulsing on their leader's neck. The message was unmistakable. To look at her was to look at him. To touch her was to invite the end of the world. "Good morning, Director Enwasu," Jun Hyuk said, his voice carrying through the silent lobby with a resonant, terrifying authority. He didn't look at his men. He looked only at her, his expression softening into a look of such raw, public devotion that it felt more intimate than a kiss. "Good morning, Jun Hyuk," she replied, her voice steady and musical, using his name without the shield of a title for the first time in public. The elevator doors hissed shut, insulating them in a private world of gold leaf and mirrors. As the lift climbed toward the top floor, Amara caught their reflection. She saw the cold boss standing behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders in a silent vow of protection, and she saw the resilient secretary who had finally found her throne. She reached up, her fingers covering his, feeling the heat of his skin and the weight of his rings. "They're afraid," she whispered, a small empowered smile playing on her lips. "They should be," Jun Hyuk murmured into her hair. "They spent 6 months watching a masterpiece and thought it was just part of the furniture. Now they know that you are the heart of this empire. Without you, there is no syndicate. There is only a monster with nothing to lose." When the doors opened onto the executive floor, the atmosphere had changed. Her old desk, the one where she had sat in silence, hiding her bruises and her brilliance, had been replaced. In its place was a sleek modern workstation that looked directly into Jun Hyuk's private office, the glass between them now clear and welcoming. But she didn't stop there. Jun Hyuk led her to the head of the boardroom table, to the very spot where she had fallen. He pulled out the chair, the heavy leather throne that sat at his right hand, and waited for her to sit. "The Strategic Reports Director," he asked, a playful dark glint in his eyes. Amara sat, her hands resting confidently on the mahogany surface where her files had once scattered like wounded birds. She looked out at the city she had once feared, then back at the man who had burned the world to keep her safe. She was no longer a secret kept in the shadows of a mafia war. She was the strength that made the dragon formidable. "Let's begin," she said, her voice echoing with the power of a woman who was finally, undeniably home. Jun Hyuk took his seat beside her, his hand finding hers under the table, anchoring them together as the doors opened and the world came in to give its report. The nightmare was over. The rain had begun. And as the first meeting of their new life commenced, the dragon and his queen looked out at their kingdom, knowing that as long as they held on to each other, they would never have to fall again.